Welcome back to another Explainer, where we're unpacking expert analysis on a massive shift happening in global relations right now. If you turn on the news today, it feels like we're constantly getting hit with headlines about trade wars, surprise tariffs, and alliances shifting overnight. But what is the underlying current actually driving all this turbulence? Well, experts are pointing to a monumental paradigm shift, a move away from traditional ideology and towards strict transactionalism in global affairs. But what does that actually mean for the everyday economy? Let's find out. So here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. We're going to look at 1. The end of ideology. 2. India's pragmatic balancing act. 3. China's massive de-risking strategy. 4. How values stack up against critical minerals. And finally, 5. The decline of the UN. All right, let's just jump right in. Section 1. The end of ideology. Navigating a new global era. This brings us to a huge fundamental query that experts are debating following recent diplomatic shakeups. Is the post-WW2 rules-based international order dead? For over 70 years, the U.S. basically maintained the stable, rules-based trading system for its allies. It gave us institutions like the World Trade Organization, and it set up these highly integrated, fairly predictable global supply chains. Basically, if you played by the rules, you benefited. But lately, with all these volatile trade policies, sudden aggressive tariffs, and shifting borders, geopolitical analysts are looking at this and saying, wow, the international law and predictability we all relied upon are seemingly being cast aside entirely.
We are literally watching a shift from an era of ideological foreign policy. Think of the Cold War, where you had these fixed alliances built on supposedly immovable shared values, to what we call transactional foreign policy. This is our current era. It's totally driven by strict economics, situational partnerships, and bilateral negotiations. It's no longer about grand, lifelong alliances based on a shared worldview. It's simply about who can offer the best deal that benefits a nation's immediate interests today. And the second that deal no longer serves the economic bottom line, boom, the partnership is quickly dissolved.
Moving on to Section 2, India's Pragmatic Balancing Act, Forging an Independent Path.
To really see this transactional shift in action, just look at the highly complex relationship between the U.S. and India. Talk about diplomatic whiplash. Step 1. The U.S. suddenly slaps volatile tariffs of up to 50% on Indian goods. Now, India didn't just passively accept this, they pivoted instantly. Step 2. Reacting to that economic pressure and a global energy crisis, India aggressively moved to purchase highly discounted Russian oil, while simultaneously pushing for massive independent trade deals with the EU. And that bold maneuver forced Step 3. The U.S. literally had to scramble, hastily initiating these diplomatic repair missions to salvage the strategic relationship and try to sell American energy. It is pure reactive transactionalism, action, reaction, and an immediate pivot.
And here's the absolute crux of it. Because India relies so heavily on its own massive domestic consumption, they are actively choosing strategic neutrality over strict Western alignment. Strategic Studies professor Brahmachalani hit the nail on the head here. He says, India is a world by itself. It doesn't have to choose sides. I mean, think about it. They import far more than they export. They have a domestic market of over 1 billion people, meaning they aren't completely beholden to Western markets to keep their economy afloat. They are strategically maneuvering to look out for their own interests, completely independent of the old East versus West binary.
All right, Section 3, China's de-risking strategy, the economic rivalry.
This transactional mindset is super obvious when we look at the immense economic maneuvering between the world's two largest economies. For years, Western powers talked openly and loudly about decoupling from China. Well, according to market research experts, the hard data shows China actually listened, and they decoupled from the U.S. first. Look at this. Back in 2017, a full 17% of China's exports went to the U.S. Today, that number has plummeted to just 11%. China took the initiative to de-risk its own economy from American reliance long before the U.S. could successfully isolate them.
And here's the wild part. While the West was busy debating decoupling, they completely failed to build up their own industrial bases to match. The sheer scale of China's leverage here is honestly staggering. They control 90% of rare earth refining, which is absolutely essential for modern tech, electric vehicles, defense systems, you name it. They dominate the refining of key commodities like nickel, chrome, and copper. But it goes way beyond technology into basic life-saving healthcare. China produces 90% of global antibiotics and effectively 100% of the world's ibuprofen and paracetamol. In a purely transactional world, that is an almost unimaginable level of leverage. If you want to decouple, but your geopolitical rival literally manufactures the base ingredient for basically every painkiller in your local pharmacy, who really holds the cards?
And then we have this number, $680 billion. That represents China's current US dollar holdings. For years, China held roughly $1.4 trillion in reserve. Methodically dumping more than half of those holdings is a financial earthquake. Basically, after watching the US weaponize its currency with global sanctions, Chinese leadership actively pushed to unbank themselves from the greenback. They moved aggressively toward alternative trading systems, gold, and regional currency swaps. By slashing their exposure so drastically, they're ensuring they are much less vulnerable to any ideological or financial punishments from the West in the future.
Which brings us to Section 4, Values versus Critical Minerals, the acid test.
So, how deep does this new transactionalism actually run when it clashes directly with long-held Western values? Well, in some instances, ideology seemingly does still win out. Europe, for example, absorbed massive, unprecedented energy costs to slash Russian natural gas imports from 40% all the way down to 12% following the invasion of Ukraine. They took a huge hit to their manufacturing base and domestic heating costs. So yes, in certain high-stakes geopolitical theaters, values, solidarity, and ideological opposition still dictate major, costly policy decisions.
But, and this is a critical distinction, experts impartially contrast those symbolic sanctions with what happens when critical minerals are on the line. The U.S. imposes strict sanctions over human rights allegations in places like Xinjiang. Yet, when Kazakhstan recently adopted some highly restrictive, repressive legislation that would usually draw immediate Western condemnation, there was absolute silence from Washington and Brussels. Why? Analysts point out it's simply because the West desperately needs Kazakhstan's critical minerals for the green energy transition, and they're currently funding transit routes there. Pragmatism, quietly but very firmly, overrides ideology.
Finally, Section 5, the decline of the UN, the global fallout.
If national interests are now eclipsing international norms, what on earth happens to the global institutions designed to keep the peace? This stark assessment reflects just how marginalized the UN has become. Macro Advisory CEO Chris Wafer bluntly states the institution is walking dead and its period of usefulness has long since passed. In a world totally dominated by rapid, transactional deal-making between major economic powers acting in pure self-interest, an institution built to uphold a universal, collective, values-based order is finding itself entirely sidelined. It's basically been acting merely as an ineffective bystander during major recent conflicts.
The reality is, the UN is locked in a state of paralysis, totally unable to take major decisions. The structure simply hasn't been updated to reflect the reality of modern emerging powers. Combine that with a severely gridlocked Security Council, where major nations remain constantly at loggerheads, refusing to compromise. And when a body like the Security Council is permanently frozen, smaller nations are left incredibly vulnerable. They realize the global cavalry isn't coming, which forces them into making their own rapid, transactional deals with local superpowers just to ensure their own survival.
Here is the big takeaway. When you abandon a rules-based system for a purely transactional one, instability is practically guaranteed. We are currently living through a highly volatile transition period. The post-WWI era is undeniably fading, and historically, whenever we move from one global order to another, it brings profound turbulence. The major powers are tearing down the old framework right now, but the contours of whatever this new system is going to be, they remain entirely unclear.
So, as the era of ideology fades, what new system will actually fill the void left by these post-WWI institutions? I'll leave you to ponder that critical question as we wrap up today's explainer on this unprecedented global paradigm shift. If the predictable rules-based order is truly giving way to ruthless, situational economic pragmatism, what will our global future actually look like? Thank you so much for joining me to break down these fascinating dynamics. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.